I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Brenda Sullivan standing at my front door with her arms crossed, and that pinched expression she always wore when she was about to make someone's day worse. I had just gotten home from my job at the aerospace engineering firm in Boulder, Colorado, still wearing my work shirt with grease on the cuffs, and all I wanted was a cold beer and maybe to check on my bees before dinner. Instead, here was the president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, ready to ruin my Thursday evening. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "we need to talk about those beehives you have in your backyard." I set down my lunch cooler and wiped my forehead. It was early June, and the Colorado heat was no joke that year. "What about them, Brenda? They're a safety hazard. I've received multiple complaints from concerned neighbors. Those bees are flying into other people's yards, and we simply cannot have that in this community. I'm going to have to ask you to remove them immediately." I took a deep breath, counting to 5 in my head. I had moved to this suburban neighborhood just outside Denver 3 years ago, right after my divorce, and I had started keeping bees about 18 months back. It had become my therapy, my way of dealing with the stress of single life and a demanding job. The 3 hives in my backyard produced the most beautiful honey I had ever tasted, and I had been generous with it, giving jars to neighbors, including Brenda herself. "The bees are completely legal, Brenda. I checked with the city and county before I ever set up the first hive. There's no ordinance against beekeeping in residential areas as long as you follow certain guidelines, which I do. My hives are more than 20 feet from any property line. I maintain a water source so they don't bother anyone's pool, and I keep the bee population healthy and manageable." Her face flushed red. "I don't care what the city says. The HOA has standards, and I'm telling you that those bees need to go. I'll be bringing this up at the next board meeting, and I expect you'll do the right thing before then." "The HOA covenants don't say anything about bees either," I replied, keeping my voice level. "I read through the entire document before I bought this house. There are rules about livestock, sure, but bees aren't classified as livestock under Colorado law. They're considered agricultural animals, which is a different category." Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see about that, Mr. Morrison. I'm sure once the other board members hear about this menace, they'll agree with me. Have a good evening." She turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway, getting into her white Lexus SUV and driving off. I stood there for a moment, feeling my blood pressure slowly returning to normal. This was exactly the kind of thing I had worried about when I first considered getting bees. I knew some people were afraid of them, but I had been so careful, so conscientious about being a responsible beekeeper. I walked around to my backyard, where my 3-seater hive sat in a neat row near the back fence, partially shaded by a large cottonwood tree. The bees were coming and going peacefully, doing their work. I could hear the gentle hum from where I stood, a sound that had become deeply comforting to me over the past year and a half. I had named the 3 hives Athena, Beatrice, and Charlotte, and I checked on them almost every day after work. My next-door neighbor, Tom, was out in his yard watering his roses. He waved at me over the fence. "Everything okay? I saw Brenda over here." "She wants me to get rid of the bees," I called back. Tom shook his head. "That woman needs a hobby besides harassing people. Don't worry about it, Paul. Most of us like having you and your bees around. My wife loves that honey you gave us last month." That made me feel a bit better, but I knew Brenda wouldn't let this go. She had been HOA president for 6 years, and she ruled the neighborhood like a petty tyrant. She had fined people for having their trash cans visible from the street, sent violation notices for grass being a half-inch too tall, and once tried to force a family to remove their basketball hoop. because she said it was an eyesore. The only reason she hadn't succeeded in that last one was because enough people pushed back. Over the next 2 weeks, I did my research. I contacted a lawyer friend who specialized in property law, and he confirmed what I already knew. My bees were completely legal. Colorado had actually passed legislation years ago protecting the rights of beekeepers, especially in urban and suburban areas, as part of a broader effort to support pollinator populations. The state agriculture department even had a whole program encouraging backyard beekeeping. I also reached out to the local beekeeping association, and they connected me with several other people in the Denver metro area who had faced similar HOA challenges. One guy, Mike, had actually sued his HOA in Littleton, and won when they tried to force him to remove his hives. He sent me copies of the legal documents from his case, which I read through carefully. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that was mostly used for the occasional garage sale or holiday party. I showed up 15 minutes early with a folder full of documents, copies of Colorado beekeeping regulations, the relevant sections of our HOA covenants, information about the ecological importance of bees, and even a petition I had circulated that had gotten signatures from 32 of my neighbors supporting my right to keep the hives. Brenda was already there along with the other 4 board members. Richard, an accountant in his 60s, Patricia, a retired school teacher, Jim, who owned a local hardware store, and Susan, a stay-at-home mom with 3 kids. I knew most of them casually, had chatted with them at neighborhood barbecues and such. They seemed like reasonable people, which gave me hope. About 20 other residents showed up, more than usual for these meetings. Word had gotten around about the bee controversy. I recognized most of the faces, and I was pleased to see that Tom and his wife Linda were there, along with several other neighbors I had given honey to over the past year. Brenda called the meeting to order and went through the usual business, approving the minutes from the last meeting, discussing the budget for landscaping the common areas, talking about plans for the 4th of July block party. Finally, she got to what she called new business. As many of you know, we have a situation in the neighborhood that poses a potential safety risk. Mr. Paul Morrison has been keeping beehives in his backyard, and I've received complaints about bees entering other properties. While Mr. Morrison claims his hives are legal, I believe they violate the spirit of our community standards and could pose a danger, especially to children and anyone with bee allergies. I raised my hand. I'd like to respond to that. Brenda looked annoyed but nodded. Go ahead. I stood up and held up my folder. First, I want to make it clear that I'm not just claiming my bees are legal. They absolutely are legal under Colorado state law, Denver County ordinances, and our city zoning regulations. I have documentation here from the Colorado Department of Agriculture, as well as a letter from an attorney confirming this. I passed around copies of the documents. Second, our HOA covenants, which I've read thoroughly, make no mention of bees or beekeeping. There's a section about livestock, but bees are specifically excluded from livestock definitions under state law. They're classified as agricultural animals. Richard, the accountant, was looking through the documents I had handed him. This looks pretty thorough, Paul. Third, I continued, bees are essential pollinators. They're responsible for pollinating about 1/3 of the food we eat. Their populations have been declining nationwide due to pesticides, disease, and habitat loss. By keeping bees, I'm actually helping the environment and supporting our local ecosystem. Every garden in this neighborhood benefits from having my bees around. Patricia, the retired teacher, spoke up. I have noticed my tomatoes have been doing better the past couple of years. I wonder if that's related. It very well could be, I said. Honeybees are incredibly efficient pollinators, but beyond that, I want to address the safety concerns. In the 18 months I've had these hives, has anyone actually been stung by one of my bees? Has there been a single incident? The room was quiet. People looked at each other, but no one spoke up. The answer is no, I said, because I'm a responsible beekeeper. I maintain my hives properly. I keep them away from property lines. I provide water sources so the bees don't seek out pools or bird baths, and I regularly inspect them for any health issues. Honeybees, by the way, are generally very docile. They only sting when they feel threatened or when defending their hive. A bee flying around your garden has no interest in stinging you. It just wants to collect nectar and pollen and get back home. Brenda cut in, her voice tight. That's all well and good, Mr. Morrison, but the fact remains that some people are afraid of bees and some people have allergies. We need to consider everyone's comfort and safety in this neighborhood. I'm sympathetic to people with bee allergies, I said. My cousin has one, actually. But here's the thing. There are wild bees everywhere. Bumblebees, mason bees, carpenter bees, and yes, even feral honeybee colonies. Removing my 3 managed, healthy hives won't eliminate bees from the neighborhood. If anything, my bees are less likely to be aggressive than some wild bee species because I've selected for gentle temperament, and I keep the hives in good condition so they're not stressed. Jim, the hardware store owner, leaned back in his chair. I've got to say, Brenda, I don't see what the problem is. Paul's making good points here. The bees are legal, they're not bothering anyone, and honestly, I wouldn't mind trying some of that honey everyone keeps talking about. A few people laughed, and I saw Brenda's jaw tighten. This isn't about honey. This is about maintaining our property values and our community standards. Actually, Tom spoke up from the back of the room, I think the bees add value to the community. It's kind of unique and interesting. My kids have learned a lot about nature from watching Paul work with his hives. He even gave a little presentation at their school about beekeeping. That was true. I had volunteered to talk to the 3rd grade class at the local elementary school a few months back, bringing in an observation hive and talking about the importance of bees. The kids had loved it, and several teachers had thanked me afterward. Brenda was looking more frustrated by the minute. Let's put it to a vote then. All in favor of requiring Mr. Morrison to remove his beehives. She raised her own hand. No one else did. All opposed. The other 4 board members raised their hands. The motion fails, Richard said. Paul, you're fine to keep your bees. Brenda, I think we need to move on to other business now. Brenda looked like she had bitten into a lemon, but she couldn't argue with a 4-to-1 vote. Fine, but I'm putting everyone on notice that if there are any incidents involving these bees, Mr. Morrison will be held responsible. Fair enough, I said, though I'm confident there won't be any incidents. The meeting wrapped up shortly after that, and several neighbors came up to congratulate me or ask questions about the bees. One woman asked if I did hive tours, and I told her I'd be happy to show her around sometime. Jim from the hardware store asked about getting some honey, and I promised to bring him a jar. As people filed out, Brenda remained seated, furiously typing something on her phone. I gathered my documents and headed for the door, feeling relieved and vindicated. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next day, I found a letter in my mailbox from the HOA. It was a formal notice citing me for having structures in my backyard that hadn't been approved by the Architectural Review Committee. According to the letter, the beehives counted as outbuildings, and any outbuilding required advance written approval from the committee before installation. I read the letter twice, anger building in my chest. This was clearly retaliation. The covenants did have a section about outbuildings, but it was clearly meant to apply to things like storage sheds, gazebos, and detached garages. The section specifically mentioned structures exceeding 6 feet in height or 50 square feet in area. My beehives were maybe 3 feet tall and took up perhaps 10 square feet total. I called my lawyer friend Marcus and read him the letter. "That's a stretch," he said. "Beehives aren't typically considered structures in the way that section means, but technically they could argue it." "Do you have any pictures from when you installed them?" "Yeah, plenty. I documented the whole process." "Good. Send me those along with the HOA letter. I'll write up a response. Don't ignore this, but don't worry too much either. This is clearly retaliatory and a court would see right through it." Marcus drafted a response letter that was professional but firm, pointing out that the architectural review section was clearly not intended to apply to items like beehives, garden boxes, or similar small backyard features. He noted that many residents had similar or larger items in their yards, such as playsets, dog houses, and storage boxes, none of which had required architectural review. He also pointed out that the timing of this notice, coming immediately after the board had voted against Brenda's attempt to ban my bees, suggested improper motivation. I sent the letter, and for a few weeks, things were quiet. I went about my business, taking care of the bees, going to work, living my life. The summer was beautiful that year, and the bees were thriving. I was getting ready to harvest honey in mid-July. Then Brenda showed up at my door again, this time on a Saturday morning. I was in my beekeeping suit, having just finished inspecting Athena. "I need to speak with you," she said, not even bothering with pleasantries. I pulled off my veil. "What is it, Brenda?" "I've been doing research, and I found something interesting. Your hives are within 50 feet of a common area. According to Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our covenants, no resident may conduct any business or commercial activity that impacts common areas without board approval." "I'm not running a business," I said. "This is a hobby." "You're producing honey, aren't you? I've heard you give it away to neighbors. Who's to say you're not selling it as well?" "I'm not selling anything. Every jar of honey I've produced has been either for my own use or given away as gifts to friends and neighbors." "Including you, if I remember correctly. You seemed to enjoy it at the time." Her face flushed. "That's beside the point. The bees fly over the common area to get to and from your hives. That impacts the common area." I stared at her, genuinely amazed at the lengths she was going to. "Brenda, birds fly over the common area. Butterflies fly over the common area. Are you going to try to ban those too? Don't be ridiculous. This is about your bees specifically." "No, this is about you not getting your way at the board meeting. You're abusing your position as HOA president to harass me because you personally don't like my bees, despite the fact that they're completely legal and the rest of the board voted to allow them. How dare you accuse me of abuse of power? I'm protecting this community." "From what?" "From bees that pollinate everyone's gardens and produce honey. From an activity that's environmentally beneficial and completely harmless. Or are you protecting the community from the terrible crime of me having a hobby that you personally disapprove of?" We stood there glaring at each other for a long moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice icy. "You haven't heard the last of this, Mr. Morrison. I will find a way to get those bees out of this neighborhood." "Good luck with that," I said. "I've got the law on my side and apparently most of the neighbors too." She left, and I went back to my bees, but the interaction had soured my mood. I realized that Brenda was going to make this her personal crusade, and I was going to have to stay vigilant. Over the next month, strange things started happening. I got notices about my grass being too long, even though I had just mowed the day before and it was no longer than anyone else's. I got a complaint about my trash cans being visible from the street, even though they were in the exact same place they'd always been, tucked against the side of my garage. I got a notice about a discolored patch on my driveway that allegedly violated the community aesthetic standards. Every single notice came with Brenda's signature at the bottom. Every single one was petty, frivolous, and clearly part of a harassment campaign. I documented everything, taking photos with timestamps, and kept copies of all correspondence. Marcus advised me to respond to each notice in writing, politely but firmly pointing out the frivolous nature of the complaints, and to keep building a case for harassment. If this goes to court, you want a clear pattern of behavior documented, he said. But what really pushed things over the edge happened in early August. I came home from work one day to find that someone had knocked over one of my beehives. Beatrice had been pushed off her stand and was lying on her side, the boxes partially separated, bees swarming around in confusion and anger. I was horrified. Knocking over a beehive wasn't just vandalism, it was potentially deadly for the colony. The frames inside could have been damaged, the queen could have been injured or killed, and the disruption could cause the entire colony to abscond or fail. I immediately got into my bee suit and started working to assess the damage and reassemble the hive. Fortunately, the hive bodies hadn't completely come apart, and I was able to carefully right the hive and get it back on its stand. The bees were agitated, but as I worked slowly and carefully, using smoke to calm them, they started to settle down. I did a quick inspection and was relieved to find that the queen appeared to be fine and the frames, while jostled, hadn't been completely destroyed. But I was furious. This had to have been deliberate. The hive stand was stable, and there was no way it had just fallen over on its own. There had been no storms, no strong winds that day. Someone had come into my backyard and knocked it over. I immediately called the police. When the officer arrived, a young guy named Officer Rodriguez, I showed him the hive and explained what had happened. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked, taking notes. "I have suspicions," I said carefully. "I've been having an ongoing dispute with the HOA president. She's been trying to force me to remove my beehives, even though they are completely legal. She's been sending me frivolous violation notices for the past month." "That's quite an accusation. Do you have any proof she was involved?" "No direct proof, but the timing is suspicious. And honestly, I can't think of anyone else who would do this. My neighbors all like the bees." Officer Rodriguez nodded. "I'll file a report. You might want to consider getting a security camera set up back here, especially if you think someone might come back." That was good advice. After the officer left, I went online and ordered a set of outdoor security cameras with night vision and motion detection. They arrived 2 days later, and I spent an evening setting them up, positioning them to cover my backyard, including the area where the hives were located. The cameras turned out to be a very good investment. About a week after I installed them, I got a motion alert on my phone at 11 o'clock at night. I pulled up the app and watched in real time as a figure in dark clothing climbed over my back fence and approached the beehives. I didn't even think. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911 and ran out my back door, flipping on the backyard floodlights as I went. "Hey," I shouted. "Get away from my property." The figure froze, then turned and ran back toward the fence. But I had gotten a good look in the floodlights. It was Brenda. 911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice came through my phone. "Someone just tried to vandalize my property. I have them on camera. They're trying to flee the scene." I gave my address and stayed on the line while the dispatcher sent officers. By the time the police arrived, Brenda was long gone, but I had crystal clear footage from my security cameras showing her climbing my fence, approaching the hives with what looked like a stick or a crowbar, and then fleeing when I turned on the lights and confronted her. Officer Rodriguez was one of the responding officers, and he recognized me from the previous call. "Mr. Morrison, another incident with the bees." "Yeah, but this time I've got her on camera." I pulled up the footage on my phone and showed him. His eyebrows went up. "Is that Brenda Sullivan?" "You know her. We've had a few calls about her over the years. HOA disputes mostly. She's got quite a reputation." He watched the footage again. "This is good quality. Can you send this to me?" I emailed him the video clips. The officers went to Brenda's house, which was about 4 streets over from mine, and I got a call about 30 minutes later asking if I wanted to press charges. "Absolutely," I said. The next day, I learned that Brenda had been arrested and charged with criminal trespassing and attempted vandalism. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the evening, I must have gotten 20 calls and texts from neighbors who had heard about it. Tom came over with a 6-pack of beer. I always knew Brenda was intense, but I never thought she'd actually break the law over this bee thing. "Honestly, neither did I," said, accepting a beer gratefully. "I thought she'd just keep sending me annoying letters. So what happens now?" "With the HOA, I have no idea. I guess they'll have to elect a new president." The legal process moved forward. Brenda got a lawyer and tried to claim that she had just been checking on the noise complaint, and that my bees had been swarming aggressively, so she had needed to defend herself. It was nonsense, and the video evidence clearly showed her approaching the hives with what appeared to be the intent to damage them. Meanwhile, the HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Brenda as president. Richard took over in the interim. He called me personally to apologize for what had happened. "I had no idea she was taking things this far," he said. "On behalf of the board, I want to assure you that we support your right to keep your bees, and we're going to make sure this kind of harassment doesn't happen again." "I appreciate that, Richard. Also, if you have any of that honey available, I'd love to buy a jar or two," I laughed. "I don't sell it, but I'll give you some for free. It's the least I can do." Over the next few weeks, I gave away dozens of jars of honey to neighbors. It had been a great year for the bees, and I had harvested about 60 pounds of honey from the 3 hives. Everyone who tried it raved about the flavor, which had notes of clover and wildflower, with just a hint of the lavender that grew in several nearby gardens. The one person who didn't get any honey was Brenda, obviously. I had given her honey twice before, back when we had been on friendly terms, before she had started her crusade against my bees. Now, there was no way she was getting so much as a spoonful. Brenda's court date came in late September. Marcus went with me for moral support, though I wasn't required to be there. The judge was not sympathetic to Brenda's excuses. The video evidence was clear, and the fact that she had been conducting a documented harassment campaign against me beforehand didn't help her case. She was convicted of criminal trespassing and attempted vandalism, sentenced to 6 months of probation, a $1,000 fine, and ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from my property. She was also required to write a formal letter of apology, which arrived in my mailbox about a week later. It was curt and perfunctory, clearly written under duress, but I didn't care. I had won. The HOA held elections for a new president in October. Patricia, the retired teacher, won easily. Her first act was to formally clarify in the HOA rules that beekeeping was explicitly permitted, as long as beekeepers followed state and local regulations. She also established a policy that any HOA board member who was found to be harassing residents would be immediately removed from the board. Life settled back into a comfortable routine. I continued to care for my bees, going through the fall and preparing them for winter. I wrapped the hives in insulation, made sure they had plenty of stored honey to get them through the cold months, and reduced the entrances to help them maintain warmth. One Saturday in November, I was out in the backyard doing some final winterizing when I heard a voice from over the fence. "Paul, you got a minute?" It was Jim from the hardware store. I walked over to the fence. "Sure, what's up?" "I've been thinking about getting into beekeeping myself. After watching all this drama with Brenda and seeing how passionate you are about it, it got me interested." "Would you be willing to teach me?" I grinned. "Absolutely. Come on over and I'll show you the basics." Jim came around to my backyard and we spent the next hour talking about bees. I showed him the hives, explained the basics of colony structure and behavior, talked about the equipment needed and the time commitment involved. He was genuinely interested, asking smart questions and taking notes on his phone. "I think I'm going to do it," he said. "In the spring, I'll set up a couple of hives. Think you could help me get started?" "I'd be happy to. There's a great beekeeping supply store over in Boulder, and the Colorado Beekeeping Association has beginner classes in the spring. I'll send you the information." As winter settled in, I found myself reflecting on the whole bizarre situation. What had started as a simple hobby had turned into a neighborhood drama, a legal battle, and ultimately a criminal case. But through it all, the bees had just kept doing what bees do, pollinating flowers, making honey, and going about their business completely oblivious to the human drama swirling around them. There was something profound in that, I thought. The bees didn't care about HOA politics or property values or Brenda Sullivan's personal vendetta. They just lived their lives, working together as a colony, each bee doing its part to support the whole. Maybe there was a lesson in that for all of us. Christmas came, and I made gift baskets with jars of honey, beeswax candles I had made, and little packets of wildflower seeds to encourage pollinator-friendly gardens. I gave them to all my neighbors, except of course for Brenda, who I occasionally saw driving through the neighborhood but who never came near my street. In January, I got an email from Patricia, the new HOA president. She was organizing a neighborhood meeting for February to discuss community initiatives for the coming year, and she wondered if I would be willing to give a presentation about the bees and maybe talk about how other residents could support pollinator populations, even if they didn't want to keep bees themselves. I agreed, and in February, I stood up in front of about 40 neighbors and talked about the importance of pollinators, the challenges facing bee populations, and simple things everyone could do to help. Planting native flowers, avoiding pesticides, providing water sources, and leaving some areas of their yards a little wild instead of maintaining perfect lawns. The response was enthusiastic. Several people asked about doing hive tours in the spring, and a few others mentioned that they were considering keeping bees themselves. One woman asked if there was any way to support bees without keeping hives, and I told her about mason bee houses and other native bee habitats she could install. As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond just winning the battle with Brenda. I had helped spark something in the neighborhood, a greater awareness of the natural world and our connection to it. The bees had brought people together, educated them, and inspired them to think differently about their little corner of the world. Spring arrived early that year. By late March, I was already seeing bees flying on warm days, taking cleansing flights after the long winter confinement. I did my first hive inspections in early April and was thrilled to find that all 3 colonies had survived the winter in good shape. The queens were laying eggs, the populations were building, and there was fresh pollen coming in as the early flowers bloomed. Jim kept his word and set up 2 hives in his own backyard in May. I helped him install his first package bees, showing him how to open the package, remove the queen cage, and gently shake the bees into the hive. He was nervous at first, but the bees were calm, and by the end of the process, he was grinning ear to ear. "This is incredible," he said. "I can't believe I'm actually a beekeeper now." "Welcome to the club," I told him. "Fair warning, it's addictive. You'll probably end up with more hives than you planned." He laughed. "We'll see about that." By June, there were 5 beekeepers in the neighborhood, all of us sharing information, helping each other with inspections, and trading equipment and advice. We formed an informal beekeeping group and started meeting once a month at different people's houses to discuss our hives, share successes and challenges, and just enjoy each other's company. The neighborhood gardens were more vibrant than ever that year. People commented on how much fruit their trees were producing, how healthy their vegetables looked, how profusely their flowers were blooming. The connection between the increased bee population and the improved gardens wasn't lost on anyone. I saw Brenda from a distance a few times that summer. She looked older, more tired. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had put her house on the market and was planning to move. I felt no satisfaction in that, just a kind of sadness that she had let her obsession drive her to such extremes and ultimately cost her so much. In July, I did my honey harvest, and it was even better than the previous year. I got nearly 80 pounds of honey from the 3 hives, golden and fragrant and delicious. I gave away most of it, keeping only a few jars for myself and a few more to use for making mead, a hobby I had taken up over the winter. One evening in late August, I was sitting on my back deck, watching the bees make their final foraging flights of the day, when Tom came over with his kids. "Hey, Paul, the kids wanted to see the bees before bedtime. Is this an okay time?" "Perfect time," I said. "Come on over." Tom's 2 boys, ages 7 and 9, were fascinated by the hives. They stood at a safe distance, watching the bees come and go in the fading light. I explained what they were seeing. The foragers returning with pollen, the guard bees checking everyone at the entrance, the way the bees communicated through scent and movement. "Do they remember you?" the younger boy asked. "Probably not individually," I said. "Bees don't have great eyesight and they recognize things more by scent than by sight. But they know the hive, and they know their role in the colony. Every bee has a job and they all work together to keep the colony healthy." "That's cool," the older boy said. "They're like a team." Exactly like a team. After they left, I sat there a while longer, listening to the hum of the hives settling down for the night. The whole experience with Brenda, as frustrating and stressful as it had been, had taught me something important about standing up for what you believe in and not backing down when you know you're right. The bees were legal. They were beneficial. They were important. And I had every right to keep them. Brenda's campaign of harassment had failed, not just because the law was on my side, but because the community had ultimately recognized the value of what I was doing and stood with me. September brought cooler temperatures and the beginning of fall. I started preparing the hives for winter again, removing excess supers, making sure each colony had enough honey stored to get them through the cold months. Jim and the other new beekeepers in the neighborhood came over to watch and learn, asking questions about winter management. "The key is to not bother them too much once it gets cold," I explained. "They'll cluster together to stay warm, and as long as they have enough food and the hive is properly insulated and ventilated, They'll be fine. The worst thing you can do is keep opening the hive and breaking the cluster. When do you do your first spring inspection? One of the other beekeepers, a woman named Sarah who lived 2 streets over, asked. Depends on the weather, but usually late March or early April, whenever we get a string of days in the 60s. You're looking for signs that the queen is laying and the colony is building up population. We stood around talking for another hour, sharing stories and comparing notes. It felt good to be part of this community within the community, people brought together by a shared interest and a shared commitment to supporting these incredible insects. In October, I got a notice that Brenda's house had sold. A young couple with a baby moved in shortly after. I introduced myself, brought them a jar of honey as a welcome gift, and told them a bit about the neighborhood. They were friendly and enthusiastic, and when I mentioned the beehives, the husband's eyes lit up. Oh, that's awesome. I've always wanted to learn about beekeeping. My grandfather kept bees when I was a kid. Well, we've got a little beekeeping group in the neighborhood now. You'd be welcome to join us. I'd love that. And just like that, the space that Brenda had left was filled with someone who appreciated what she had tried so hard to destroy. There was a poetry in that. Winter came, long and cold, and I spent the dark months reading about beekeeping, planning improvements for my apiary, and experimenting with new mead recipes using my honey. I had taken up woodworking as well and built several new hive boxes, painting them in different colors so the bees could better distinguish their own hive from the others. I also worked with Marcus to file a civil suit against Brenda for the harassment and the attempted vandalism. It wasn't about the money, though there had been costs involved in setting up the security cameras, legal fees, and the time I had missed from work dealing with the situation. It was about the principle, about making it clear that her behavior had consequences. The suit was settled in January. Brenda's lawyer reached out to Marcus with a settlement offer, and after some negotiation, we agreed on an amount that covered my expenses plus a bit extra. Part of the settlement also included a formal agreement that she would never again file complaints or take action regarding my beekeeping activities. With that behind me, I could fully focus on looking forward. I made plans to add a 4th hive in the spring and to try raising my own queens, a more advanced technique that would give me more control over the genetics of my colonies. I wanted to select for bees that were gentle, productive, and well adapted to Colorado's climate. February brought the first signs of spring, with warmer days here and there and the earliest flowers beginning to bloom. I started checking on the hives more regularly, though I still didn't open them. I could tell they were alive and active by watching the entrances. On warm days, I saw bees taking cleansing flights and bringing in pollen from the early crocuses and snowdrops that were blooming in yards around the neighborhood. In March, our beekeeping group met at my house, and we made plans for the upcoming season. Jim was going to expand to 4 hives. Sarah was starting her 2nd year and felt confident enough to try splitting one of her colonies to make a new one. The young couple from Brenda's old house, whose names were Derek and Melissa, had ordered package bees and would be installing them in April. "This is really growing into something special," Patricia said. She had started attending our meetings, even though she didn't keep bees herself. "I've been thinking we should do some kind of event for the whole neighborhood. Maybe a honey festival in the fall where everyone can taste honey from different hives, learn about beekeeping, that kind of thing." The idea was met with enthusiasm, and we started planning. It would be a way to celebrate what had begun as my solitary hobby and had grown into a neighborhood-wide appreciation for bees and pollinators. April arrived with warm sun and blooming trees, and I did my first full hive inspections of the year. All three colonies were thriving, with healthy populations and queens laying eggs in strong patterns. The sight of frames covered with capped brood, workers tending to larvae, and bees bringing in loads of bright yellow and orange pollen filled me with the same wonder and satisfaction it always did. This was why I had fought so hard against Brenda's attempts to force me to give up the bees, not out of stubbornness or spite, but because this mattered. The bees mattered. The act of caring for them, learning from them, and sharing the fruits of their labor with my community mattered. I helped Derek and Melissa install their first package bees on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Half the beekeeping group showed up to watch and assist, and we made it a party, with pizza and beer afterward. Derek was nervous but excited, and by the end of the process he was already talking about getting a second hive next year. "I get it now," he said, watching his new bees exploring their hive. "I get why you fought so hard for this. This is really special." "It is," I agreed. "And the best part is, you get to share it. Every jar of honey you give away, every conversation you have about the bees, you're spreading that a little bit further." May and June were busy months in the apiary. The bees were bringing in nectar from the abundant flowers, and I had to stay on top of adding supers to give them enough space to store honey. Jim and I started experimenting with different hive configurations, comparing notes on productivity and bee behavior. The neighborhood gardens were spectacular that year. It seemed like everyone had gotten into the spirit, planting more flowers, avoiding pesticides, and creating pollinator-friendly spaces. The number of butterflies, native bees, and other beneficial insects had noticeably increased, and the whole area felt more alive, more vibrant. In July, I did my honey harvest, and this time I got over 100 pounds of honey from my now 4 hives. The quality was exceptional, with complex flavors that reflected the diversity of flowers in our area. I saved several frames with the comb still intact, planning to sell pieces of comb honey at the fall festival. The first annual Meadowbrook Hills Honey Festival took place on a Saturday in late September. We set up tables in the neighborhood common area, with displays about beekeeping, samples of honey from different hives, beeswax products, and informational materials about pollinators. Local artists brought bee-themed crafts, and one of the neighbors who was a baker made honey cakes and cookies. Over 200 people showed up, including residents from neighboring communities who had heard about the event. Kids got to look at an observation hive I had set up, safely enclosed in glass so they could watch the bees working without any danger. We gave presentations about bee biology, the importance of pollinators, and how to create pollinator habitats in any yard. The event was covered by the local newspaper, and the article that came out the following week was titled, "Neighborhood Comes Together Over Bees." It told the story of the conflict with Brenda, though without naming her directly, and how it had ultimately led to a community-wide appreciation for pollinators and the environment. I was quoted in the article. "Sometimes conflict can lead to something positive. If none of this had happened, we might still be just a bunch of neighbors who wave to each other in passing. Now we're a community that works together to support the environment and each other." The bees taught us that. As autumn deepened, and I prepared the hives for another winter, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened over the past few years. What had started with 3 beehives in my backyard had grown into something much larger. A community of beekeepers, a neighborhood committed to environmental stewardship, and a new understanding of how much we could accomplish when we worked together instead of against each other. Brenda was long gone, having moved to a different state according to what I had heard. I bore her no ill will at this point. In a strange way, her opposition had made all of this possible. If she had just accepted the bees from the beginning, I might have kept to myself, quietly maintaining my hives without much interaction with the neighbors. Instead, her campaign against me had forced me to engage, to educate, to build alliances and community. The bees continued their work, oblivious to all the human drama. They pollinated flowers, made honey, and went about the complex business of maintaining their colonies. In their own way, they had transformed not just my life, but the entire neighborhood. And as for free honey for Brenda, that ship had sailed a long time ago. She had made her choice when she decided to wage war against my bees, and one of the consequences was that she would never taste another spoonful of my honey. Every jar I gave away to supportive neighbors, every taste I shared at the festival, every time someone told me how much they loved the honey, I thought about that choice she had made. Winter settled in again, and the bees clustered in their hives, staying warm and waiting for spring. Our beekeeping group continued to meet monthly, now talking about plans for the coming year, discussing what we had learned, and supporting each other through the challenges of winter management. I stood in my backyard on a cold December evening, looking at the hives covered in their winter wraps, and felt a deep sense of contentment. The bees were safe, the community was strong, and I had learned valuable lessons about standing up for what was right, about the importance of education and communication, and about how something as simple as keeping bees could ripple outward in unexpected ways. The honey jars lined up in my pantry represented more than just a sweet treat. They represented a victory over small-minded opposition, a community coming together, and the fruits of partnership between humans and nature. Every jar I gave away told that story, shared that victory, and spread a little more sweetness into the world, all except for Brenda, of course. She had complained about my beehives, tried to force me to remove them, harassed me, and ultimately committed crimes in her obsession to get rid of them. The bees were legal and they were staying, and she would never, ever taste my honey again. That felt like justice, simple and sweet.